The cold rain felt like shattered glass against Elara's skin as she was violently thrown into the unforgiving mud. Her knees struck the jagged stones of the border crossing, the physical pain entirely eclipsed by the soul-crushing reality of what was happening to her. Standing above her was her own father, his face twisted in a mask of greedy relief. He had actually done it. He had finally sold her away. The heavy iron gates of the Shadow Fortress loomed ahead, a terrifying jagged silhouette against the stormy night sky. This was the domain of Alpha King Kaelen, the feral warlord known as the Butcher of the North. Rumors whispered across the lands that no Omega who entered his dark realm ever survived a single moon cycle. They said he was deeply cursed, driven mad by ancient blood magic, tearing through his enemies and his own people with equal ruthless brutality. And now Elara, a fragile and invisible maid who had never known a day of kindness, was his property. She was traded away just to settle a gambling debt. The guards of the Dark Kingdom stepped forward, their heavy armor gleaming in the flashes of lightning, their eyes filled with cold pity as they looked down at the trembling girl in the mud. Elara closed her eyes tightly, letting the freezing rain wash over her tears, simply waiting for the end. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The massive iron doors of the Shadow Fortress slammed shut behind Elara, severing her completely from the only world she had ever known. The echoing boom resonated through the marrow of her bones, finalizing her doom. She stood dripping in the cavernous entrance hall, a tiny, shivering shadow swallowed by the oppressive grandeur of black marble and towering obsidian pillars. No one greeted her. No one offered a warm hearth or a dry cloak. A stern, gray-haired head housekeeper materialized from the gloom, her eyes sweeping over Elara with a mixture of disdain and tired resignation. "You are the debt payment," the woman stated, her voice as cold as the polished stone beneath their feet. "You will clean the forgotten East Wing. You will speak to no one. If you cross the king's path, you will bow your head, close your eyes, and pray he does not notice you. Follow me." Elara followed, her bare feet numb against the freezing floors. As she was led deeper into the labyrinth of the fortress, her mind drifted backward, seeking refuge in the familiar, even if the familiar was painted in shades of cruelty. She remembered the cramped, suffocating attic of her family home. She had always been the invisible servant there, scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled, eating the meager scraps left by her beautiful, haughty sisters. Her father only ever looked at her when he needed someone to blame for his own failures. "You are nothing but a burden," he would spit, his heavy hand leaving stinging red marks across her pale cheeks. "You are a defective Omega, useless and weak." The memory of those words wrapped around her throat like a tight collar. She had spent 19 years shrinking herself, learning to hold her breath, learning to blend into the wallpaper so she would not invite violence. She thought she knew what fear was. She thought the beatings and the starvation were the worst the world had to offer. But the Shadow Fortress was a different kind of terror. Here, the air itself felt heavy with unspoken violence and ancient sorrow. The East Wing was a desolate stretch of endless corridors and dust-covered rooms, forgotten by time and abandoned by the living. Her small, windowless chamber was barely larger than a closet, furnished with a lumpy mattress and a single woolen blanket. Yet, as she curled into a tight ball on the hard bed that first night, a strange, hollow sense of relief washed over her. There were no drunken footsteps stumbling up the stairs to beat her. There were no sisters throwing hot tea at her face for ironing their dresses incorrectly. There was only the suffocating silence of the dark castle. Days bled into nights in a monotonous blur of exhausting labor. Elara scrubbed the long, empty hallways, polished the clouded mirrors, and swept the cobwebs from the high vaulted ceilings. She was a ghost haunting the edges of a nightmare, Sometimes she would hear the heavy, terrifying boots of the Alpha King's personal guard marching through the distant main halls. Sometimes a low, bone-rattling growl would echo through the stone walls, a sound so primal and full of agony that it made Elara drop her brushes and cover her ears. The other servants whispered in terrified clusters in the kitchens, speaking of the king's declining state. "The blood curse is tearing his wolf apart," they murmured, their eyes wide with dread. "He destroyed half the throne room yesterday. We are all gonna die when he finally snaps." Elara listened from the shadows, pressing her small body against the cold walls, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had not seen King Kaelen yet. She had strictly obeyed the housekeeper's orders, remaining invisible, scrubbing the forgotten corners of his massive estate. She thought if she just stayed small enough, she might survive. She thought she could simply exist as a speck of dust in his grand, terrifying world. But the universe had never been kind to Elara, and her illusions of safety were violently shattered one freezing evening. She had stayed late in the upper galleries, scrubbing a stubborn stain from the floorboards, the pale moonlight filtering through the high stained glass windows. She was humming a soft, ancient lullaby to herself, a desperate attempt to ward off the creeping loneliness, when the temperature in the gallery suddenly plummeted. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall violently burst open, splintering into jagged pieces that crashed against the stone walls with a deafening roar. Elara froze, her breath catching painfully in her throat, the wet rag slipping from her trembling fingers to land with a wet slap on the floor. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. A towering, monstrous silhouette stood in the ruined doorway, radiating a suffocating aura of absolute, crushing dominance and feral, unrestrained rage. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist around his massive frame, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and raw, unchecked magic. It was the Alpha King. His chest heaved with ragged, terrifying breaths, his eyes glowing with a violent, unnatural crimson light in the darkness. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. He stepped into the gallery, the floorboards groaning under his immense weight, and slowly, his glowing, feral eyes locked directly onto her small, trembling form. The crimson gaze of Alpha King Kaelen pinned Elara to the cold stone floor, stripping away any hope of escape. He did not look like a king, he looked like a nightmare unleashed. His massive chest heaved, tearing the fine black fabric of his tunic, revealing thick corded muscles straining under the unbearable pressure of the blood curse that ravaged his veins. Shadows, thick and almost liquid, lashed out from his body like whips, cracking against the walls and shattering the remaining stained glass windows into a million glittering, deadly shards. Down the corridor, the heavy, panicked footsteps of his elite guards echoed, but they stopped at the ruined doorway. They were the most lethal warriors in the realm, yet they looked upon their feral king with sheer, unadulterated terror. No one dared to step into the gallery. No one dared to intervene. To approach the king in his cursed frenzy meant instant death. Elara was trapped. She pressed her spine against the freezing wall, making herself as small as humanly possible, her hands covering her face in a desperate, futile shield. She could hear the heavy, predatory thud of his boots advancing toward her. Each step shook the floorboards. Each step vibrated with raw, murderous intent. The air in the gallery grew sickeningly heavy, suffocating her with the metallic tang of his aggressive, out-of-control alpha pheromones. It felt as though an invisible hand was wrapping around her throat, choking the life from her fragile lungs. He let out a low, guttural snarl that rattled the marrow in her bones. This is it, she thought, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her pale cheeks. This is how I die. Forgotten, invisible, torn apart in the dark. But as the towering shadow of the king fell over her, entirely blocking out the pale moonlight. Elara felt something else beneath the suffocating terror. It was a sensation she had carried her entire life, a deep, painful empathy that she had always been punished for. Beneath Kaelen's monstrous rage, beneath the bloodlust and the terrifying aura of dark magic, Elara felt an agonizing, bottomless ocean of pain. She could feel his fractured mind splintering. She could feel the unbearable agony of the curse tearing his soul to shreds, torturing him from the inside out. He was not just a monster, he was a prisoner screaming in a burning cage. And in that terrifying, final second, as Kaelen raised a massive, clawed hand to strike her down, Elara's survival instinct shattered, replaced by a pure, overwhelming wave of sorrow for the broken creature before her. She let out a soft, involuntary sob, and with it, her hidden gift broke free. For 19 years, she had suppressed her true nature, forcing down her scent because her abusive pack called it a freakish mutation. But now, driven by raw empathy, it exploded from her small, trembling body. The scent of pure white lotus blooming in a sacred pool, mixed with the crisp, clean essence of heavy rain falling upon a sun-baked, drought-stricken earth, flooded the ruined gallery. It was not merely an Omega's sweet fragrance, it was a physical force, a tidal wave of ancient, soul-soothing energy. The moment the scent hit the air, the violent, whipping shadows surrounding the king instantly froze. The oppressive, choking weight of his feral magic dissolved into mist. Kaelen's descending claw stopped mere inches from Elara's tear-stained face. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. He gasped a harsh, ragged intake of breath, as if he had been drowning for decades and had finally broken the surface of the water. The suffocating agony that had dominated his mind for years suddenly vanished, washed away by the incredibly pure, healing aura radiating from the tiny, terrified maid cowering beneath him. The feral, glowing crimson light in his eyes flickered, fought for dominance, and then shattered entirely, melting into a striking, lucid silver. The king staggered backward, his heavy boots stumbling over the broken glass. He brought a large, trembling hand to his own chest, taking long, deep breaths in absolute shock. The agonizing fire in his blood was gone. The whispering demons of his curse were completely silent. For the first time since he was a young man, King Kaelen felt absolute, profound peace. And it was radiating from the ragged, trembling girl pressed against the wall. He slowly lowered himself, his knees hitting the hard floor with a heavy thud, bringing himself down to her level. The guards at the door gasped in collective shock, watching their untouchable, terrifying warlord bow before a lowly, purchased servant. Elara kept her eyes squeezed shut, still shaking violently, expecting the final blow. But the blow never came. Instead, Kaelen leaned closer, his silver eyes wide with raw disbelief and desperate awe. He breathed in deeply, his large, scarred hands reaching out to hover hesitantly near her face, terrified that if he touched her, she might vanish like a dream. He had bought her as a worthless pawn, a piece of trash to settle a debt. But as he looked at the tears shimmering on her eyelashes, he realized he had brought a miracle into his cursed fortress. "Who are you?" Kaelen whispered, his deep, rough voice echoing through the silent, breathless gallery. Elara pressed her back harder against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering violently, like a trapped bird. The scent of white lotus and fresh rain still lingered faintly in the air, a beautiful contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the gallery. She looked at the Alpha King, who was staring at his own hands in absolute disbelief. The terrifying, monstrous aura that had surrounded him just moments ago had vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, trembling stillness. He looked up at her, his striking silver eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made it hard for her to breathe. But Elara could not find joy in this sudden peace. Instead, an icy wave of familiar, paralyzing terror swept through her veins. She had revealed her secret. She had let them see what she really was. Her mind spiraled backward into the dark recesses of her memories, returning to the cruel pack house where she had been raised. She remembered the day her secondary gender had presented when she was 15. When the change came, she had not given off the common scent of a typical Omega. Instead, this exact fragrance of blooming lotus and summer rain had filled the pack house. At first, she thought it was a blessing from the moon goddess. But her old Alpha, a brutal and paranoid man, had looked at her with pure hatred. He declared her scent to be an unnatural anomaly, a freakish mutation. They called it a curse. They accused her of practicing dark magic, claiming her sweet scent was a deceptive tool meant to weaken strong warriors. From that day on, her life became a living hell. The pack shamans forced her to drink bitter herbs designed to suppress her aura, scorching her throat. Her family beat her whenever her scent leaked, locking her in the damp cellar for days without food. "You are a monster, Elara," her father would hiss, his heavy whip striking her bare back until she bled. "If you ever let that scent out again, we will cut your throat." They taught her to loathe her own nature, making her believe that her only gift was a dangerous weapon. She had spent years mastering the art of suppression, locking her soul behind a wall of absolute silence, pretending to be the weak, defective Omega they claimed she was. And now, she had broken her own rule in front of the most ruthless Alpha King in the world. Elara watched Kaelen rise slowly to his feet, his massive frame towering over her once more. The silver light in his eyes was hypnotic, but she could only see it as the calm before a devastating storm. He was going to punish her. He was going to lock her away or execute her for using witchcraft against his wolf. The silence in the gallery was suffocating, broken only by the whistling wind outside the shattered windows. Kaelen opened his mouth to speak, but before the words could form, the head housekeeper and a dozen armed guards rushed into the room. The housekeeper took one look at the shattered glass, her eyes wide with terror as she fell to her knees. "Forgive us, Your Majesty," the woman cried out. "The useless maid must have provoked your wolf. I will have her dragged to the dungeons immediately and punished for her insolence." Elara closed her eyes, bowing her head in silent acceptance, ready to accept the dark fate she had run from for so long. But the guards did not move. King Kaelen turned his freezing, silver gaze upon the housekeeper, his voice cutting through the room like a blade of ice. "Touch her, and you lose your hands," the king commanded, the low frequency of his voice making the stone floor vibrate. The housekeeper gasped, her face draining of all color. Kaelen turned back to look at Elara, his expression a complex mix of reverence, intense curiosity, and a deep, unspoken sorrow. He looked at her tattered clothes, her bruised knees, and the sheer terror mirroring in her beautiful eyes. He took a slow breath, absorbing the final, lingering traces of her healing scent. "Clean her up," Kaelen ordered, his eyes never leaving Elara's face. "Bring her to my private chambers in the high tower within the hour. Do not keep me waiting." With those final, heavy words, the Alpha King turned and strode out of the gallery, his long black cloak billowing behind him. Elara stood frozen in the center of the ruined room, her breath caught in her throat. The high tower was a place where no servant was ever allowed to step, a fortress within a fortress. She was not being sent to the dungeons, but she was being summoned to his private sanctuary, entirely helpless and at his absolute mercy. Elara walked with trembling steps through the winding obsidian corridors of the high tower, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The servants who had bathed her and dressed her in a simple, clean white gown had spoken no words, their hands shaking as they brushed her hair, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and pity. They believed she was walking straight to her execution, or worse, to become a permanent plaything for a mad king. Now the heavy oak doors of the king's private sanctuary stood before her, carved with ancient runes of protection that seemed to pulse with a faint, ominous blue light. The elite guards pushed the massive doors open with a low, groaning sound, and she was gently but firmly nudged inside. The doors closed behind her with a definitive thud, sealing her fate. The room was massive, a sprawling sanctuary filled with the deep, comforting scent of old parchment, dark wood, and the lingering, intoxicating smoke of burning embers. Thick velvet curtains hung over the tall, arched windows, blocking out the stormy night, though the distant rumble of thunder still vibrated through the stone floorboards, matching the erratic rhythm of her own pulse. King Kaelen stood by a massive stone fireplace, his back to her, watching the dancing flames. He had changed into a loose black tunic, his long silver hair falling over his broad shoulders like a cascade of moonlight. The heavy, suffocating pressure of his alpha aura that had nearly choked her in the gallery was now dialed back. Yet his presence alone was enough to make Elara feel completely weightless, like a fragile leaf caught in a powerful, invisible current. She stood near the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes cast downward, waiting for the interrogation she was certain would come. The king did not turn around immediately. He seemed to be listening to the crackle of the flames, absorbing the sudden, profound quietness of the room that her presence had brought. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that sent a strange, electric shiver down Elara's spine. "You do not need to hide your face from me, Elara," he said softly, the words carrying a gentle weight that she had never heard from an alpha before. The sound of her name on his lips felt strange, almost sacred, completely different from the way her father used to spit it like a curse. He turned slowly, his striking silver eyes locking onto her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. There was no madness left in them now, no crimson fire of the blood curse, only a deep, exhausted curiosity and an unspoken reverence. "Come closer," he murmured, extending a large, scarred hand toward her. Elara hesitated, her entire body freezing. Every instinct honed by 19 years of brutal abuse screamed at her to flee, to run back to the dark, dusty corners of the East Wing, where she could blend into the shadows and be forgotten. But as she looked into his silver eyes, she saw something that shocked her to her core. She saw a profound, ancient vulnerability, a reflection of the same loneliness and pain that had haunted her own existence. She took a tentative step forward, her bare feet sinking into the plush furs covering the floor. She stopped a few feet away from him, her breath shallow, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. "Why did you save me from my own wolf?" Kaelen asked, his silver eyes searching her face, trying to read the secrets hidden behind her pale, fragile exterior. "You had every reason to let me destroy everything, including myself. Your family sold you to me like a piece of worthless property to settle a debt. They told me you were defective, a broken thing. Why show mercy to a monster who was meant to be your tormentor?" Elara swallowed hard, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and a sudden, rising warmth she could not explain. "I did not see a monster," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire, yet carrying an unbreakable sincerity. "I only saw someone who was hurting, someone who was trapped in a darkness so deep that no one else could hear them screaming." Kaelen's eyes widened slightly at her words, a flicker of raw, undisguised emotion passing over his harsh, handsome features. He opened his mouth to reply, but before a single word could escape, the protective ancient wards etched into the stone walls violently shattered with a deafening crack. The blue light of the runes vanished, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural darkness. The warm fire in the hearth was instantly extinguished, plunging the massive room into a freezing gloom. The heavy velvet curtains were shredded to pieces as dark, shadowy figures broke through the massive glass windows, stepping into the room from the stormy night, accompanied by a howl of freezing wind. Assassins. They did not wear the uniforms of any known pack, their bodies covered in dark, flexible armor, their faces completely concealed by black cloth. In their hands, their weapons gleamed with a sickening, glowing green light, silver laced with dark magic, a lethal, forbidden combination specifically designed to paralyze and kill ancient alpha bloodlines by targeting their inner wolf. Kaelen reacted instantly, his protective instincts surging to life before he could even process the threat. With a fierce, deafening roar that shook the entire high tower, his alpha wolf leaped forward. A massive wave of dark shadows exploded from his body, forming an impenetrable protective shield around Elara, throwing her gently backward onto the soft furs, shielding her from the flying shards of glass. The king lunged at the first attacker, his bare hands ripping through armor with terrifying, monstrous strength. A cascade of blood splattered across the stone walls as he tore the assassin apart in a single, brutal motion. But these were not ordinary killers. They moved with an unnatural, fluid speed, completely coordinated and entirely unaffected by the horror of their companion's death. 3 more assassins lunged simultaneously, throwing glass vials filled with a shimmering, volatile liquid onto the stone floor right beneath Kaelen's feet. The vials shattered, releasing a thick, choking green mist that filled the air. The moment the mist touched Kaelen's skin, a horrific hiss echoed through the room, accompanied by the smell of burning flesh. The king staggered, a sharp gasp of pure agony ripping from his throat. The silver-laced magic was eating through his defenses, poisoning his blood, and suffocating his inner wolf, rendering his immense strength useless. The dark shadows protecting Elara flickered violently and dissolved into nothingness. Kaelen fell heavily to one knee, his massive body trembling as the veins in his neck and face turned a terrifying, bruised purple. He fought with everything he had, swinging his fist to crush another attacker. But his movements were slowing down, becoming heavy and uncoordinated. The leader of the assassins stepped forward, a cold, triumphant sneer hidden beneath his mask. He raised a jagged, silver blade dripping with the dark, glowing poison, aiming it directly at the king's exposed throat. Kaelen looked up, his silver eyes dimming as the poison took hold, staring death in the face. He did not look at the blade. Instead, with the last remaining ounce of his fading strength, he turned his head to look at Elara. His eyes were no longer those of a fierce king, but of a protector who had failed. They were filled with a desperate, silent plea, not for his own life, but for her to run, to escape the horror before the assassins turned their blades on her. Elara watched in absolute terror as the jagged blade began its final, lethal descent, her mind screaming as the world slowed down around her, forcing her to make a choice that would change everything. The sight of the deadly blade hovering above King Kaelen, throat shattered something deep inside Elara's mind. For 19 years, she had been told that she was a defective Omega meant only to be a silent shadow, enduring the blows of the world without ever striking back. But looking at the proud king who had just shielded her from flying glass, a strange, electric current ignited in her veins. It was a primal, roaring awakening. An unexplainable bond pulled at her very soul, tying her life directly to his. She knew that if his heart stopped beating tonight, her own soul would die in the dark. She could not let him die. She would not let them destroy the only person who had ever looked at her with reverence instead of hatred. With a fierce cry, Elara threw off the heavy furs and leaped to her feet. The assassins completely dismissed her as a fragile servant girl who would soon be eliminated anyway. That was their greatest mistake. They did not know the immense power that lay dormant within the girl they ignored. Elara closed her eyes, reaching deep down into the most hidden corners of her soul. She shattered the mental walls she had built over a lifetime of abuse, refusing to remain invisible any longer. She opened her arms wide, and with a deep, ragged breath, she unleashed her hidden gift with the full force of a bursting dam. A blinding wave of white light exploded from her small frame, illuminating the darkened tower room. The scent of white lotus and fresh, rain-soaked earth surged forward like a physical tidal wave, filling every square inch of the sanctuary. This time, the aura was intensely powerful, vibrating with a protective, sacred authority. The moment the luminous white energy touched the thick green poison mist, a sharp, crackling sound echoed through the room. The toxic gas dissolved rapidly, neutralized by the pure essence of her aura. The dark magic laced into the assassin's weapons began to sizzle and fade. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. The green glow dying out until the blades were nothing but ordinary dull metal. The assassins froze in absolute shock, their bodies stiffening as if they had been cast in solid stone. The pure energy radiating from Elara did not harm them physically, but it completely paralyzed their malicious intent. It flooded their minds with an unbearable weight of peace. A tranquil force so absolute that their muscles refused to obey their murderous commands. The leader of the assassins stood with his blade raised, his arms trembling violently as he fought against the invisible, soothing chains of her power, but he could not move an inch. His eyes wide with terror behind his black mask. He looked at the fragile Omega Maid who was now bathed in an ethereal, radiant glow. Kaelen felt the sudden, miraculous shift in the air. The agonizing fire in his blood vanished instantly as her aura washed over him, drawing out the silver poison from his veins like a drawing salve. His inner wolf let out a magnificent, rejuvenated roar within his mind. The dark purple bruises on his neck receded, his pale skin returning to its healthy color. He felt a surge of raw, unparalleled strength flooding back into his limbs. Amplified a tenfold by the profound connection he now felt with the girl standing before him. His silver eyes snapped open, glowing with a brilliant light that reflected the pure energy filling the room. With a powerful movement, the Alpha King rose to his feet. No longer a victim, but a terrifying force of absolute vengeance. He did not need his dark magic to deal with the paralyzed attackers. He stepped toward the leader of the assassins, his presence so commanding that the stone floor seemed to tremble beneath his boots. With a single, swift motion of his large hand, he wrenched the dull silver blade from the leader's grasp and shattered it into pieces with his bare knuckles. He grabbed the assassin by the throat, lifting him off the ground effortlessly. "Speak," Kaelen growled, his deep voice carrying the weight of a thundercloud. "Who sent you into my fortress?" The leader could only let out a choked gasp, his eyes darting past the king to look at Elara. The other assassins, slowly regaining a fraction of their mobility as Elara's strength began to waver from the sheer exhaustion of holding such a massive aura, realized their mission had completely failed. They did not wait for Kaelen to turn on them. With a desperate effort, they threw down small smoke pellets that exploded into a thick gray fog, obscuring the room. By the time Kaelen cleared the smoke with a sweep of his powerful arm, the remaining assassins had leaped back out of the shattered windows into the stormy night. Kaelen did not pursue them. His immediate priority was the fragile girl who had just saved his life. He dropped the unconscious leader to the floor and turned around instantly. The brilliant white light surrounding Elara was fading, her small body trembling with absolute exhaustion. Her face was dangerously pale, her breath coming in short gasps as the immense effort of unleashing her hidden gift took its toll. She swayed on her feet, her vision blurring as the room spun around her. She began to fall toward the hard stone floor, her strength completely spent. But she did not hit the stones. Kaelen caught her securely against his chest, lifting her effortlessly as if she were the most precious treasure. Elara looked into his silver eyes, her consciousness slipping away into the darkness, but she felt no fear. She felt safe in his protective embrace. As her eyes shut, a distant, ominous war horn began to sound below, signaling that the danger was far from over. The sound of the distant war horn faded into the background as King Kaelen carried Elara through the high stone arches of the inner fortress. He held her securely against his broad chest. His powerful arms wrapped around her fragile form with a tenderness that shocked every guard and servant they passed in the corridors. The walls of the fortress seemed less oppressive now, as if her lingering white lotus scent had permanently altered the heavy, dark atmosphere of the castle. The elite warriors who had stood paralyzed during the assassination attempt now marched in a tight protective formation around their king, their eyes scanning the shadows for any remaining threats. But Kaelen's focus never wavered from the pale, silent girl resting in his arms. She was completely unconscious, her small hands resting limply against his dark tunic. Exhausted from the immense spiritual energy she had unleashed to save his life. He could feel the faint, steady rhythm of her heartbeat through his shirt, a delicate counterpoint to the thunderous roaring of his own heart. He did not take her back to the damp, forgotten east wing where the servants slept. Instead, he carried her up the grand winding staircase toward the royal quarters, a sacred sanctuary reserved only for the highest rulers of the realm. He pushed open the double doors of the most luxurious guest suite, a room bathed in warm gold light and filled with soft silk tapestries and a massive bed piled high with velvet blankets. He laid her down upon the soft mattress as if she were made of the finest glass, pulling the heavy furs over her shivering shoulders. As he stepped back, a strange, electric sensation rippled beneath his skin. It started deep within his chest, a warm, golden spark that ignited his dormant inner wolf. For years, his wolf had been a creature of pure fury, driven mad by the blood curse, but now, it paced peacefully, nudging his consciousness with a profound sense of recognition. The realization hit Kaelen like a physical blow. The ancient mate bond, a sacred connection he believed he would never possess, was awakening. It was wrapping its invisible, unbreakable threads around his soul, tying him completely to this fragile maid. She was not just a servant traded to settle a debt. She was his fated mate, the true Luna of his kingdom. The head housekeeper arrived at the doorway, her hands trembling as she held a tray of soothing teas and clean cloths. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear as she bowed low. "We have secured the perimeter, and the royal healer is on his way. Shall we prepare the dungeon for when she wakes up, in case her strange magic returns?" Kaelen's silver eyes flared with a sudden, protective heat that made the housekeeper step back in terror. "You will speak of her with nothing but absolute reverence," Kaelen commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that shook the air. "From this moment on, she is no longer a servant. She is a royal guest of this palace. If anyone dares to treat her as less than royalty, if anyone whispers a single cruel word about her, I will personally ensure they never speak again. Prepare the finest meals, bring the softest silks, and ensure this room is guarded by my most loyal warriors. Her comfort is now the highest priority in this kingdom." The housekeeper bowed frantically and scrambled out of the room, leaving the king alone with his sleeping mate. Kaelen sat on the edge of the large bed, his eyes tracing the delicate lines of Elara's face. Without her bright white aura illuminating the room, she looked so small, so devastatingly fragile. He gently reached out his large, calloused hand hovering over her pale cheek before lightly brushing a stray lock of hair away from her forehead. The moment his skin brushed hers, a soft, pleasant warmth pulsed through the bond, sending a wave of absolute tranquility through his entire being. He felt an intense, overwhelming urge to protect her, to hide her from the harsh world that had clearly broken her spirit. He noticed the faint, dark bruises on her wrists, remnants of the cruel treatment she had suffered before she was brought to his gates. Anger, cold and sharp, ignited in his belly at the thought of anyone ever laying a hand on her. As the storm outside began to clear, letting the soft silver moonlight filter through the high windows, Elara stirred in her sleep. A soft, breathless sigh escaped her lips, and a tiny, gentle wave of her white lotus scent filled the immediate space around the bed. It was faint, but it was enough to make Kaelen's wolf purr with absolute contentment. He realized then the gravity of his initial mistake. He had let his prejudice and bitterness blind him. He had treated her like an object of trade, locking her away in the dark, when she was the very light he had been praying for in his years of absolute darkness. He vowed to himself, looking down at her peaceful face, that he would spend the rest of his days earning her trust, protecting her from every danger, and elevating her to the throne she deserved. But his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a soft knock on the door. One of his trusted generals stepped inside, his expression grim. "Your Majesty," the general reported in a low whisper, "the assassin leader we captured has succumbed to a hidden poison before we could interrogate him. However, we found a crest on his armor. It belongs to the pack that sold the girl to us. They did not just sell her to pay a debt. They sent these killers to ensure she died along with you, believing her magic was a curse that would destroy us all. They are already gathering forces at the border, claiming you broke the treaty by keeping her alive." Kaelen slowly rose to his feet, his silver eyes cold and ruthless as he looked back at his sleeping mate, a mini cliffhanger hanging in the heavy silence of the room. The soft morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long golden beams across the luxurious bedroom. Elara slowly opened her eyes, her mind foggy, and her body feeling incredibly heavy. For a moment she did not know where she was. She expected to feel the cold, damp floor of her old attic room, or the hard mattress of the servants' quarters. Instead, she was surrounded by absolute warmth. She shifted slightly, feeling the impossibly soft touch of silk sheets and thick furs against her skin. The air was rich with the scent of burning cedarwood and a faint sweet trace of her own white lotus fragrance. As her vision cleared, she realized she was lying in the center of a massive royal bed. Memory flooded back in a sudden terrifying rush. The assassins, the dark magic, the blinding white light she had unleashed, and the terrifyingly beautiful Alpha King catching her as she fell into the darkness. She gasped, sitting up quickly, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her to press a hand against her forehead. "Steady now," a deep, gentle voice murmured from the shadows near the hearth. Elara flinched, her eyes darting toward the sound. King Kaelen was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, his large frame perfectly still. He looked as though he had not slept a single wink all night. His long silver hair was tied back, and his striking silver eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse race. He rose slowly, stepping into the golden morning light, his movements fluid and cautious, as if he were approaching a wild, easily frightened creature. Elara immediately shrank back against the headboard, pulling the heavy velvet blanket up to her chin. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice trembling as her old survival instincts took complete control. "I did not mean to sleep so long. I will return to my duties in the East Wing immediately. Please do not punish the housekeeper for my laziness." Kaelen stopped in his tracks, a look of profound pain crossing his sharp features. The fact that her first instinct upon waking was to beg for forgiveness and offer herself up for labor twisted a knife deep within his chest. "You have nothing to apologize for, Elara," he said, his voice unusually soft, carrying a deep resonance that vibrated through the bond between them. "You saved my life. You neutralized a lethal poison that would have destroyed my wolf. You are not going back to the East Wing. You are a guest of honor in this castle." Elara stared at him, her mind completely unable to process his words. An Alpha King, a man known across the continents for his absolute cruelty, was speaking to her with a tenderness she had never received from her own family. She felt overwhelmed, the sudden shift in her reality, making her feel as though she were standing on shifting sands. In her confusion and haste to pull herself further away from his overwhelming presence, she moved too quickly. The loose, oversized silk gown she had been dressed in shifted, slipping completely off her left shoulder and cascading down her back. Kaelen's words died in his throat. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. His silver eyes locked onto her exposed skin, and the breath completely left his lungs. There, marring the smooth, pale perfection of her back, was a horrific tapestry of absolute cruelty. Deep, jagged white ridges of old whip scars crisscrossed her skin, overlapping one another in a chaotic web of historical violence. Some were thick and uneven, the markers of brutal beatings that had never been allowed to heal properly. Near her shoulder blade there was a faint circular scar that looked unmistakably like a burn mark from a branding iron. It was the undeniable evidence of years of systematic, unyielding torture. Elara felt the sudden cold air on her back and realized what had happened. A gasp of pure horror escaped her lips. She quickly pulled the gown back up her face, flushing a deep burning crimson as she scrambled to cover herself. She felt a profound sense of shame washing over her. To her, those scars were the physical marks of her worthlessness, the proof that she was a defective, broken thing that deserved to be hidden away in the dark. "Please," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "Do not look at me. I know it is hideous. I know I am broken. My father said I was a curse to look upon." Kaelen felt an explosion of raw, primal fury detonate within his soul. His inner wolf roared in absolute murderous outrage, demanding the blood of whoever had dared to touch their precious mate. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe and darken, responding to his sudden immense spike of emotional agony. But as he looked at the weeping girl, he forcefully suppressed his rage, refusing to let his dark magic frighten her further. He took a slow, deep breath, stepping closer to the bed until he was kneeling on the soft floorboards right beside her. He gently, hesitantly reached out his large, warm hands, covering her small, trembling wrists. With an incredible, agonizing gentleness, he pulled her hands away from her face, forcing her to look into his eyes. His silver gaze was swimming with an intense, overwhelming sorrow and an unyielding, burning determination. "Look at me," Elara Kaelen whispered, his voice thick with a raw emotion he had never allowed himself to feel before. "Who did this to you? Tell me the names of the monsters who dared to put their hands on you." Elara looked at him through a blur of hot tears, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw no disgust in his eyes, no judgment, only a deep protective reverence that shattered the final defenses around her scarred heart. "They did it because of my scent," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of a lifetime of pain. "They said my magic was a disease. They wanted to beat the freakishness out of me." Kaelen closed his eyes for a brief second, a single silent tear slipping down his scarred cheek as his heart broke for the girl before him. He realized the absolute depth of the horror she had survived. The very gift that had saved his life, the pure, beautiful essence of her soul, was the reason she had been tortured. A dark, terrifying vow solidified in his mind. The pack that had sold her, the family that had abused her, would face the full, unbridled wrath of the Alpha King. They thought they had discarded a worthless maid, but they had handed him his queen, and he would tear the world apart to avenge her. But his thoughts were cut short as the grand doors of the suite burst open, and his chief general entered with a pale face. Your Majesty, the general gasped. The border watch reports that Elara's father has arrived with a massive army, demanding her immediate return. King Kaelen turned his gaze from the door back to Elara, whose face had drained of what little color it had left. Dismissed, Kaelen barked at the general, his voice slicing through the tense air of the room. Hold them at the border. Do not strike unless they cross the line. I will be down shortly. The general bowed and hurried out, closing the heavy doors behind him. Elara pulled the velvet blanket tighter around her shoulders, her entire body shaking so violently that her teeth chattered. The mention of her father had brought back the ghosts of her past screaming into the present. She could almost feel the cold cellar, the sharp sting of the whip, and her father's heavy footsteps coming to punish her. She looked at Kaelen, her eyes wide with a desperate, heartbreaking acceptance of her fate. You're going to give me back to him, are you not? She whispered, her voice cracking into a tiny, fragile sound. It makes sense. I am just a maid. I am not worth a war between packs. My father will return your gold, and you can be free of my trouble. Kaelen's heart fractured completely at her words. A profound, suffocating wave of regret crashed over his soul, drowning his inner wolf in a sea of intense guilt. He looked at the fragile girl cowering on his royal bed, and he hated himself more than he had ever hated any enemy on the battlefield.
I saw you.
He remembered the night she had arrived at his fortress. He remembered staying in his study, indifferent to the young Omega thrown into the freezing rain at his gates. He had allowed his servants to treat her like an invisible piece of trash, sending her to sleep in the forgotten dusty corners of the East Wing. His own bitterness and curse had blinded him to the pure, radiant miracle she was. He had treated her like a slave when she was the fated keeper of his soul. The realization of his own coldness was a physical torment shifting through his veins like liquid fire. He was the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the north, yet he had failed to protect his own mate from the moment she entered his domain. He had been just another monster in her tragic story. With a slow, deliberate motion, Kaelen sank to his knees beside the bed, lowering his massive frame so that he was looking up at her. He wanted her to see that he held no power over her, that he was completely, entirely hers. Elara, he said, his deep voice thick with an unspoken sorrow that made the air vibrate with emotion. Look at me, please. Elara slowly lowered her hands, looking into the brilliant silver of his eyes, which were now clouded with a desperate vulnerability. I swear to you on my life, on my soul, and on the ancestors of this land, that I will never let that man touch you again, Kaelen said, each word a solemn, heavy vow. I would rather watch this fortress burn to ash before I let anyone touch you. You are not a maid to be traded away. You are not a burden or a piece of property. You are the only person who brought peace to my mad mind. You saved me when I was a monster trying to destroy everything. He gently reached out his large hands, resting palms up on the edge of the mattress, waiting for her to make the choice to trust him. My greatest regret is that I did not see you the moment you walked through my gates, Kaelen whispered, his eyes reflecting the soft morning light. I let you suffer in the dark corridors of this castle when you should have been wrapped in the finest silks. I was blind and cruel, and I will spend every single day of my life begging for your forgiveness. But do not ever think I will give you back. You are the heart of this kingdom now, Elara. You are my queen. Elara stared at him, the tears freezing on her cheeks. The slow burn of an unexplainable, incredible warmth began to spread through her chest, melting the icy terror that had frozen her heart for 19 years. She could feel the raw sincerity pouring through the fated bond between them, a golden thread of pure devotion that left no room for doubt. For the first time in her life, someone was standing between her and the monsters of her past. Someone was telling her that she was worth fighting for, that she belonged in the light. She hesitantly moved her small hand forward, her fingers trembling as she laid them gently over his large, scarred palm. Their connection sent a soft, beautiful pulse of energy through the room, confirming their destiny. Kaelen closed his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath, as if her touch was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. But the peace of the moment was shattered as a deep, echoing roar resounded from the courtyard below, followed by the frantic ringing of the alarm bells. The enemy forces had breached the outer border earlier than expected. Kaelen rose to his feet, his silver eyes instantly transforming into an icy lethal glare as his protective instincts completely took over. He turned to Elara, leaning down to gently press his forehead against hers for a brief electric second. "Stay here where it is safe, my queen," he whispered fiercely. "I am going to end this nightmare once and for all." He turned and strode toward the door, his black cloak billowing behind him, leaving Elara alone with a racing heart as the sounds of battle began to echo through the stone walls. The echoes of the distant battle faded as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of violet. The immediate threat at the border had been swiftly crushed by King Kaelen and his warriors, proving that the Dark Kingdom was not a place to be trifled with. 3 days had passed, and Elara had been moved to a beautiful glass conservatory connected to the royal gardens. For the first time, she was not surrounded by dust or the fear of violence. Instead, she sat on a plush velvet settee, watching the moonlight filter through the glass panes, illuminating rare night-blooming flowers. She wrapped her fingers around a warm cup of tea, trying to adjust to the safety of her new life. It felt like a beautiful dream she was terrified of waking up from. Every day since the attack, Kaelen made it his mission to show her a level of care she had never known. He did not treat her like a servant or an object he had purchased. He treated her like something sacred, a treasure he was honored to protect. Her thoughts drifted to how the servants now looked at her with quiet respect. They brought her fresh fruits, soft gowns woven from fine silk, and books filled with ancient tales. The ruthless warlord became completely transformed whenever he entered her presence. The heavy glass doors of the pavilion slid open, and Elara looked up, her heart doing a familiar, pleasant flutter. Kaelen stepped inside, his massive frame illuminated by the moonlight. He had shed his heavy battle armor, wearing only a simple dark tunic that made him look less like a terrifying king and more like a man seeking solace. In his large hand, he carried a polished wooden box, and across his arm hung a soft cloak made of white fur. He walked toward her with slow steps. His striking silver eyes locked onto hers with a gentle warmth that instantly melted the last remnants of her anxiety. "May I sit with you, Elara?" he asked softly, always giving her the space and power to choose. Elara nodded gently, a soft smile gracing her lips. "Please, Your Majesty," she murmured. Kaelen sat on the opposite end of the settee, his large presence filling the space without making her feel suffocated. He placed the white fur cloak over her shoulders, his hands careful not to brush against her skin too abruptly, though his warm touch sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "The nights are getting colder, and I want to ensure you never feel the chill of this fortress again," he said. Elara smoothed her hands over the luxurious fur, tears of gratitude pricking her eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "I have never owned anything so fine. My sisters always wore soft furs, while I was given only tattered rags." Kaelen clenched his jaw, a flash of cold anger passing through his eyes at the mention of her past. But he quickly softened his expression, refusing to let his anger disturb her peace. He placed the polished wooden box on the table and gently pushed it toward her. "This is for you as well," he said. "Open it." With trembling fingers, Elara lifted the lid. Inside, resting on black velvet, was a breathtaking necklace made of pure silver, featuring a delicate pendant of a white lotus flower blooming around a brilliant moonstone. It radiated a faint, comforting energy that felt remarkably similar to her own hidden gift. "This belonged to my mother, the former queen," Kaelen said, his silver eyes watching her reaction with an anxious vulnerability. She was a woman of peace. When I saw your aura, when I realized the pure, healing light you carry, I knew that this belonged to you. It was meant for the true Luna of this kingdom. Elara gasped, her hands hovering over the beautiful heirloom. Your Majesty, I cannot accept this, she said, her voice shaking with unworthiness. This is a royal treasure. I am just a maid from a disgraced pack. Kaelen reached forward, his warm hand gently covering hers. His touch was firm but tender, sending a powerful wave of reassurance through the fated mate bond that connected their souls. You are not just a maid, Elara, he said, his silver eyes burning with conviction. You are the woman who brought peace to my mind. You are the light that shattered my curse. You hold more value than all the gold in this fortress combined. Let me show you what it means to be cherished. Elara looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she did not see the broken girl she had been forced to be. She saw a future where she had a voice, where she was loved, and where she was powerful enough to change the world. She allowed him to lift the silver necklace from the box, her heart pounding a sweet rhythm as he stepped closer, carefully fastening the clasp around her delicate neck. The cool metal rested against her skin, but it felt incredibly warm, igniting a beautiful glow within her chest. They sat together in the quiet conservatory, talking for hours as their deep romance fully blossomed, an unbreakable trust forming between them. But as the moon reached its highest point in the night sky, a shadow suddenly fell over the glass pavilion. The ground beneath them began to vibrate with a low, ominous tremor, and the sweet fragrance of the flowers was instantly replaced by the sickening smell of dark magic. Kaelen stood up instantly, his silver eyes flashing with a dangerous light as a frantic guard burst through the doors, his face pale with absolute dread. Your Majesty, the guard gasped, the High Council has arrived with the High Shamans, and they have brought an ancient decree to strip the Omega of her title and execute her for witchcraft. The grand throne room of the Shadow Fortress was filled with a suffocating tension that crackled through the air. King Kaelen strode down the marble aisle, his hand gripping Elara's small fingers with an unyielding protective strength. Elara walked beside him, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she refused to let her head fall. She wore the beautiful silver necklace Kaelen had given her, the moonstone gleaming against her pale skin, a symbol of her transformation from an invisible maid to the chosen mate of the king. At the far end of the hall stood the High Council, a group of elderly, arrogant alphas dressed in heavy robes alongside the high shamans who carried iron staffs that vibrated with dark, restrictive magic. They looked down at Elara with eyes full of deep disgust and cold prejudice, completely ignoring the miraculous peace she had brought to the kingdom's ruler. The oldest counselor in Alpha, named Malachur, stepped forward, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings like thunder. Your Majesty, he began, his tone dripping with false reverence, we have come to enforce the ancient laws of the northern pacts. This girl you harbor is a defective Omega from a bloodline of recognized traitors. Her family has marched to our borders, accusing you of violating the treaty. Furthermore, the shamans have felt the strange, unnatural energy she unleashed during the assassination attempt. This is not the aura of a true Luna. This is dark magic witchcraft meant to enslave your inner wolf and weaken our kingdom. We demand that you hand her over to the council for a trial or execute her immediately to purge this curse from our lands. Elara felt a cold wave of familiar fear try to wrap around her throat at his words. The accusations of being defective, of being a curse, were the exact same psychological weapons her family had used to break her spirit for 19 years. For a fleeting second, she wanted to shrink back to hide behind Kaelen's massive frame and return to the safety of the shadows. But as she looked at the arrogant faces of the council members, she felt a sudden sharp ignition of inner strength. She remembered the scars on her back, and she remembered how she had saved the king from the poison. She was no longer that helpless, silent girl who could be traded away like property. She had a voice and a purpose. She squeezed Kaelen's hand, letting her white lotus scent ripple softly through the air, a quiet declaration of her unyielding spirit. King Kaelen felt her silent resolve, and a wave of immense pride mixed with a terrifying primal fury washed over his soul. His silver eyes snapped toward Malachor, glowing with a lethal, freezing intensity that made the surrounding guards instinctively take a step back. The shadows in the corner of the throne room began to writhe and expand, responding to the absolute rage of the Alpha King. "You dare speak of laws to me, Malachor," Kaelen growled, his deep voice carrying the heavy frequency of an approaching storm. "You sit in my hall safe behind my walls while this fragile woman risked her life to save your king from a cowardly assassination plot. Her magic, as you call it, is a sacred healing gift that neutralized a lethal poison that would have destroyed my wolf. She is not a spy, and she is not a curse. She is my fated mate, the true Luna of the Shadow Fortress." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobles and counselors. The mate bond was a legendary sacred connection, and the thought of a purchased maid becoming the supreme ruler of the North sent shockwaves through the political hierarchy. Malachor's face turned a furious shade of red, his fingers tightening around his staff. "This is madness, your majesty," he hissed, refusing to back down. "A fated mate cannot come from a disgraced servant bloodline. You are being manipulated by her scent. If you refuse to surrender her, the High Council will declare you unfit to rule. We will sever our alliances, withdraw our warriors from your borders, and leave this fortress isolated against the gathering armies of her former pack. You are choosing a single broken Omega over the survival of your entire empire." The threat of civil war and total isolation hung heavily in the air, a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Kaelen stepped closer to the council, his massive presence radiating an absolute, terrifying dominance that made the stone floor beneath their feet groan under the weight of his power. "Let them come," Kaelen whispered, his voice cutting through the room like a blade of ice. "Withdraw your warriors, sever your alliances, and see how well you survive without the protection of my wolf. But know this, if any man among you, or any army at my border attempts to lay a hand on my mate, I will not just defend these walls. I will hunt you down, I will tear your pack houses to the ground, and I will ensure your names are erased from the history of this realm. Elara is my queen, and her word is my law." The absolute finality in the king's voice silenced the throne room completely, leaving the counselors trembling with fear. Malachor looked at the terrifying warlord and realized Kaelen was completely willing to watch the entire world burn to ash just to keep the small Omega safe. The political conflict had reached a boiling point where words were no longer enough to hold back the storm. Malachor narrowed his eyes, a dark, treacherous glint mirroring in his gaze as he bowed stiffly. "As you wish, your majesty," he muttered, his voice tight with malice. "We shall see if your wolf can protect her when the true trial begins." He turned and signaled the council to retreat, their heavy robes sweeping across the marble floor as they exited the hall, leaving Kaelen and Elara standing together in the heavy, breathless silence as the shadows of war deepened. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the departing council members, leaving an eerie, echoing silence in the grand throne room. The flickering torches cast long, twisting shadows across the black marble floor, reflecting the turbulent emotions raging within the hall. Elara stood frozen, her hands still enveloped in Kaelen's massive, warm grip. Her heart was beating frantically against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage. She looked at the towering king beside her, his sharp jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek, and his brilliant silver eyes still flared with the residual embers of his terrifying primal fury. She knew the gravity of what had just happened. The High Council had openly threatened to abandon the fortress, to strip her of her dignity, and to plunge the entire northern realm into a brutal civil war, all because of her. The familiar heavy weight of guilt began to press down on her chest, a dark, whispering voice from her past reminding her that she was nothing but a source of trouble, a broken Omega who brought destruction wherever she went. Kaelen turned his gaze down to her, the icy lethal mask he had worn for the council melting instantly into an expression of profound tenderness and absolute devotion. He saw the dimming light in her beautiful eyes and the way her small shoulders began to sink under the invisible weight of her thoughts. He stepped closer, wrapping his other hand around her waist, pulling her gently against his broad chest. "Do not let their words hollow you out, Elara," he murmured, his deep voice a soothing, resonant vibration that instantly cut through the dark fog in her mind. "They are old men blinded by ancient prejudices and terrified of a power they cannot control or comprehend. You are not a curse. You are the salvation of this kingdom, and I will gladly watch every single one of their thrones burn to ash before I ever let them tear you from my side." Elara looked up into his silver eyes, feeling the slow, beautiful burn of the mate bond washing away her doubts. She breathed in his comforting scent of dark wood and burning embers, letting it anchor her soul. For 19 years she had been told to stay silent, to accept her abuse because her life was worth nothing. But looking at this fierce, protective king, who was willing to defy his entire empire for her, she felt a new unfamiliar emotion rising within her chest. It was a spark of true empowerment. "I am not afraid of them," she said, her voice quiet but remarkably steady, carrying a newfound strength that made Kaelen's inner wolf purr with absolute pride. "I spent my whole life running and hiding in the dark corners of the world. I will not hide anymore. If they want a war because I am alive, then let them see that I am no longer the helpless maid they sold into the dark." Kaelen let out a low, breathless laugh, his eyes shining with a fierce, reverent light as he leaned down to press his forehead against hers. "That is my queen," he whispered, his warm breath brushing against her lips, sending a wave of electric sweetness through her veins. "We will face them together, and we will rebuild this world into a place where no one will ever have to hide their light again." The moment was pure, sacred, and filled with a slow burning, earned romance that made the vast, empty throne room feel like a private sanctuary. But the fragile peace was brutally shattered. The heavy iron-reinforced doors of the throne room were violently thrown open, crashing against the stone walls with a deafening boom that echoed like thunder through the castle. A scout from the outermost northern border stumbled into the hall, his armor covered in thick mud and dark stains of blood. He collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as the elite guards rushed forward with their weapons drawn. "Your Majesty," the scout gasped out, his voice trembling with an absolute sheer terror that made the hairs on Elara's arms stand up. "The border has fallen. It is not just a raid. It is a massive invasion force." Kaelen released Elara, instantly stepping forward, his presence transforming back into the lethal, terrifying warlord in a split second. "Speak, warrior, who has dared to cross my lines," Kaelen commanded, his voice rattling the glass windows of the high gallery. The scout lifted his pale face, his eyes wide with dread. "It is Elara's former pack, Your Majesty," the scout explained, coughing heavily. "Her father has allied himself with the rogue factions of the southern territories. They have gathered thousands of warriors, and they are marching under a black banner. They are demanding that you return the Omega Maid to them immediately, or they will unleash a forbidden weapon. They have uncovered an ancient dark relic, an artifact of compressed silver magic that can permanently sever the mate bond and destroy an alpha's inner wolf from miles away. They claim you stole their most valuable asset, and they will wipe the Shadow Fortress off the face of the earth if you do not surrender her by sunrise." Elara felt the blood drain from her face, her hand instinctively flying to the silver lotus necklace around her neck. Her former family had not just come to take her back. They had come to destroy Kaelen, to rip away the only source of love and peace she had ever known, using a weapon meant to permanently mutilate his soul. She looked at Kaelen, seeing the dark shadows around him explode into a wild, suffocating cloud of pure, unbridled fury. The ultimate conflict had arrived at their doorstep, and the morning sun would bring either their final salvation or their absolute destruction. The air inside the ancient temple beneath the Shadow Fortress was thick with the scent of age-old stone and burning sage. Deep beneath the black marble foundations lay the sacred pool of the Moon Goddess, a place where only the supreme rulers of the North were permitted to tread. The walls were carved with giant murals depicting the first wolves, their crystal eyes catching the flickering light of 100 silver torches. Outside, the distant thrum of the approaching enemy army vibrated through the earth, a terrifying reminder that time was bleeding away. Yet, inside this holy sanctuary, King Kaelen stood with absolute, unwavering resolve. He turned to Elara, his silver eyes burning with a deep, sacred fire that banished the chill of the underground chamber. The high shamans who had remained loyal stood around the perimeter, their iron staffs resting against the floorboards, their faces filled with a mixture of dread and profound anticipation. Kaelen reached out, his large hands gently taking Elara's small, cold fingers into his own. He looked down at her, seeing the lingering shadows of fear in her eyes, but beneath that fear, he saw the brilliant, unyielding diamond of her spirit. "We will not fight this war in the shadows, Elara," Kaelen said, his deep voice echoing off the ancient vaulted ceiling like a holy vow. "They want to strip you of your voice and treat you like property, but tonight, the whole world will see who you truly are. I will not march into this battle as a cursed, lonely king. I will march beside my declared Luna, my fated equal, the true sovereign of the North." Elara looked at the glowing silver waters of the sacred pool, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind raced back to the dark cellar where she had spent her childhood, a place where her voice was met with blows and her presence was considered a disgrace. The thought of stepping onto the royal altar, of claiming a power that had been beaten out of her for 19 years, sent a wave of vertigo through her soul. She felt so incredibly small against the backdrop of history, a simple maid caught in the gears of an empire. But as she looked at Kaelen, seeing the absolute reverence and unyielding trust in his eyes, she realized that she was no longer alone. He was offering her his kingdom, his soul, and his protection. He was giving her the stage to finally speak, to finally become the person she was always meant to be. She took a deep breath, letting her white lotus scent expand through the ancient temple, a beautiful, fragrant answer to his declaration. "I am ready," she whispered, her voice carrying a clear, melodic strength that surprised even the high shamans. "I will not hide anymore." Kaelen smiled, a rare, breathtaking sight that filled her heart with an incredible warmth. He led her up the stone steps of the altar, right to the edge of the silver pool. The high shaman stepped forward, lifting a golden chalice filled with the sacred moon-blessed water. "To claim the mate bond publicly, to bind your souls before the eyes of the goddess, requires absolute surrender," the shaman intoned, his old voice trembling. "The power will test your spirit, child. It will tear down every wall you have built to survive." The ancient chants began, a low rhythmic humming that resonated with the very stones of the fortress, drawing out the latent magical energies sleeping deep within the earth. Kaelen did not hesitate. He drew a silver dagger from his belt, lightly pressing the blade against his own palm, letting his royal alpha blood drip into the silver waters. The pool instantly reacted, glowing with a brilliant, luminous blue light that cast long, ethereal shadows across the stone walls. He turned to Elara, holding his hand over the water. "Trust me, my queen," he murmured. Elara reached out, taking the silver dagger from his hand. She did not feel fear as the sharp edge touched her skin. She felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. She sliced her palm, letting her blood mingle with his in the sacred pool.
Back.
The moment their blood joined, a massive, thunderous roar echoed through the temple, and the silver water surged upward like a living tidal wave. The ancient runes on the walls exploded into a brilliant white light, answering the call of her hidden gift. The high-stakes ritual had fully commenced, a spiritual transformation that would either forge an unstoppable bond or shatter their souls under the weight of the goddess' judgment. The mini cliffhanger lingering in the blinding light that swallowed them both completely as the chamber began to shake with supernatural energy. The blinding white light from the sacred pool swirled around Elara and Kaelen like a celestial vortex, lifting them slightly above the ancient stone altar.
I saw you.
The sensation was overwhelming, an intense rush of pure cosmic energy that flooded Elara's veins, burning away the lingering coldness of her childhood trauma. For the first time in her life, she did not feel small or broken. The spiritual power of the moon goddess was peeling away her defensive layers, forcing her to confront the vast, untapped ocean of magic sleeping within her soul. She looked at Kaelen through the radiant mist, his silver eyes glowing with a brilliant, blinding intensity that reflected the depths of his absolute devotion. The fated mate bond between them pulled tight, humming like a golden harp string, vibrating with a physical force that made the entire subterranean temple shake. Kaelen reached forward, his large, scarred hands gently cupping her face, his touch sending a beautiful wave of electric warmth straight to her heart. "This is our destiny, Elara." His deep voice echoed directly inside her mind, clear and powerful, unburdened by the dark whispers of his old curse. "You are my equal, my savior, and the true ruler of this realm. Let the world see your light." Elara leaned into his touch, her inner thoughts finally falling into a beautiful, profound silence. She realized she was no longer a victim fleeing from the blows of her abusive family. She was no longer the invisible servant scrubbing the forgotten corners of a dark fortress. She was the chosen mate of the Alpha King, the keeper of his peace, and a beacon of hope for an entire empire. She opened her heart completely, letting go of her shame and her fear, allowing her hidden gift to merge flawlessly with his royal alpha energy. Kaelen lowered his head, his lips brushing against the soft skin of her neck, right where her shoulder met her collarbone. He paused for a brief, electric heartbeat, giving her one last chance to pull away. But Elara only pressed closer, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders in absolute surrender. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kaelen pressed his teeth into her skin, completing the sacred mate mark. An explosion of raw, unparalleled power detonated within the temple. A colossal shockwave of brilliant white light burst from the altar, tearing through the ancient stone ceiling and shooting straight up into the stormy night sky like a holy beacon. The oppressive darkness that had cloaked the shadow fortress for centuries was instantly obliterated, replaced by an ethereal, radiant glow that bathed the entire dark kingdom in a warmth it had never known. The scent of white lotus and fresh, rain-soaked earth erupted across the lands, a massive tidal wave of healing energy that washed over every guard, every servant, and every citizen within the fortress walls. The dark restrictive magic carried by the high shaman's iron staffs dissolved into nothingness, their weapons clattering against the stone floorboards as they fell to their knees in absolute awe and reverence. The servants who had once looked at Elara with pity rushed to the balconies, watching in wonder as the dead, withered gardens of the palace suddenly burst into beautiful, vibrant bloom under the influence of her majestic aura. Within the sacred chamber, the transformation was complete. Elara lowered her feet back to the hard stone altar, but she stood different now. The pale, fragile maid was gone, replaced by a breathtaking, powerful queen who radiated an undeniable sovereign authority. Her skin glowed with a faint pearlescent light, and her striking eyes carried a brilliant silver depth that perfectly matched the king's. The silver lotus necklace around her neck pulsed with a sacred energy, mirroring the intricate, glowing mate mark carved permanently into her skin. Kaelen stepped back, looking at his mate with an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. He fell to one knee before her, taking her small hand and pressing a tender, respectful kiss against her knuckles. "Long live the Luna Queen," Kaelen declared, his deep voice carrying a thunderous pride that echoed through the entire fortress. The high shamans and the elite guards immediately followed his lead, bowing their heads low against the floorboards, acknowledging her supreme rule. Elara looked out across the bowing assembly, her heart swelling with an incredible, empowering strength. She had finally found her voice, she had finally found her power, and she was ready to face the monsters of her past as an untouchable ruler. The time for hiding was over, and her true reign had just begun. The grand throne room was no longer a place of terrifying shadows and cold oppression. Bathed in the ethereal radiant white light of the completed mate bond, the massive hall seemed to breathe with a magnificent sacred life. The fragrance of blooming white lotus flowers and crisp clean rain hung elegantly in the air, a permanent testament to the divine power Elara had unleashed. Side by side on the towering twin obsidian thrones sat the rulers of the north. King Kaelen looked absolutely magnificent, his silver hair catching the luminous glow of the room, his powerful frame radiating a calm, deadly authority. Beside him sat Elara, dressed in a breathtaking gown of pure woven silver silk that flowed over the steps like liquid moonlight. The silver lotus necklace rested proudly against her collarbone, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the glowing mate mark on her neck. She sat with her shoulders back, her head held high, her striking silver eyes fixed on the massive iron doors at the far end of the hall. She was no longer the invisible servant cowering in the dark. She was the supreme Luna Queen, and she was ready. The heavy iron doors groaned as they were violently thrown open, signaling the arrival of the enemy delegation. Walking into the throne room with supreme arrogance was Elara's former pack master Alpha Vance, followed closely by her father Baron Richard and her two older sisters Clara and Melissa. They were flanked by a dozen heavily armed warriors who carried the black banner of their Southern Alliance. They walked with smug satisfaction, their footsteps echoing loudly against the polished marble floorboards. They believed they held the ultimate upper hand. They believed their ancient dark silver artifact had already terrified King Kaelen into absolute submission, and they fully expected to find the fortress on its knees. They expected to see Elara thrown in chains at the foot of the dais, a broken, worthless slave being returned to her rightful masters to face her public execution. Elara watched them approach, her inner thoughts drifting back to the dark memories of her childhood. She looked at her father's face, seeing the same cruel, greedy eyes that had looked at her with utter disgust for 19 years. She looked at her sisters who had spent their lives tormenting her, throwing hot tea at her face and laughing as she scrubbed their muddy boots. For a brief second, the phantom sting of her father's heavy whip seemed to tickle the scars on her back, trying to drag her back down into the suffocating abyss of her old fear. But the moment the anxiety tried to tighten around her throat, the golden thread of the mate bond flared warmly within her soul. She felt Kaelen's immense protective presence beside her, a solid, unyielding mountain of absolute devotion. The divine magic of the moon goddess hummed in her blood, reminding her of who she truly was. She realized with a profound, sudden clarity that they had no power over her anymore. The monsters of her past were nothing but small, pathetic creatures standing in the light of her true sovereignty. Baron Richard stepped forward, his chest puffed out with a sickening pride. He did not look up at the thrones, immediately his arrogance blinding him to the radical transformation of the room. "We have come to collect our property," he announced, his loud, pompous voice grating against the sacred silence of the hall. "Your Majesty, you have violated the treaty by keeping the defective Omega alive. We know her magic is a corrupting disease, and we have brought the black artifact to cleanse your fortress if you resist. Hand the useless maid over to us now, along with double the gold you paid for her, to compensate for the trouble she has caused our pack. Do this, and we might allow your kingdom to survive the night." Clara and Melissa sneered in agreement, their eyes scanning the floorboards, expecting to see their pathetic sister groveling in the dust. Silence, heavy and suffocating, descended upon the throne room. King Kaelen did not move a single muscle, but the temperature in the hall plummeted to a freezing sub-zero chill. Slowly, Baron Richard frowned, sensing that something was deeply wrong. He lifted his head, his eyes traveling up the grand marble steps of the dais, past the elite guards, and finally locking onto the twin thrones. The smug satisfaction on his face instantly withered away, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. His jaw dropped, his eyes widening so much that they looked as though they would pop out of his skull. Clara and Melissa gasped in collective shock, their hands flying to their mouths as their faces, drained of all color, turning a sickening shade of white. They're sitting upon the highest throne of the realm, clad in the finest royal silks and radiating a powerful, blinding silver aura, was the very girl they had starved, beaten, and sold like trash. Elara looked down at them, her silver eyes carrying a terrifying divine majesty that made her father's knees tremble violently. She looked absolutely breathtaking, completely untouchable, a goddess walking among mortals. They could feel the immense crushing weight of her pure Alpha Luna power suffocating their inner wolves, forcing them to bow their heads against their own free will. "You speak of property," Richard Kaelen spoke, his deep, rough voice booming through the throne room like a thunderclap that shook the heavy stone pillars. The shadows around his throne writhed with a murderous intent that made the enemy warriors drop their banners in terror. "You stand in the presence of the Supreme Luna Queen of the North. You stand before the woman who saved my life, who shattered my curse, and who holds the absolute authority of this empire." The family stood paralyzed, their minds completely shattered by the reality before them. Elara slowly leaned forward, her voice echoing with a clear, resonant power that struck absolute terror into their dark hearts. "You sold me to a king expecting my destruction," she said, her words slicing through the silence like a silver blade. "But today you face your queen, and the debt of your cruelty will finally be paid in full." The mini cliffhanger hung in the freezing air as Kaelen's warriors surrounded the terrified family, blocking every single exit. The air in the grand throne room grew thick with the heavy scent of ozone and the terrifying pressure of King Kaelen's unbridled alpha rage. He rose slowly from his obsidian throne, his claws extending from his large knuckles, gleaming in the radiant white light. The dark shadows wrapped around his massive frame like a living armor, roaring with a hunger to tear the arrogant abusers to shreds. Baron Richard fell to his knees, his hands shaking violently as he pressed his forehead against the cold, polished marble floorboards, his pride completely shattering into a million pieces of pathetic desperation. Clara and Melissa collapsed beside him, their elaborate silk dresses pooling in the dirt as they wept loudly, begging for a mercy they had never shown to their younger sister. Alpha Vance stood frozen, his face a mask of sweating terror, his warriors dropping their weapons one by one as the absolute dominance of the Alpha King crushed their inner wolves into submission. "Kill them all," Kaelen growled, his deep voice a seismic rumble. "Tear them apart and feed their flesh to the crows at the border. Let the world know the price of touching my fated mate." The elite guards moved forward, their swords drawing a harsh metallic sound, ready to execute the command. But before a single drop of blood could stain the immaculate white marble, Elara stood up from her throne. She did not raise her voice. Yet the simple rustle of her silver silk gown was enough to make every warrior freeze in their tracks. "Kaelen," she said softly, her voice carrying a beautiful, crystal-clear resonance that instantly cut through his dark fury. The king stopped, his blazing silver eyes snapping to her face, his feral wolf instantly calming at the sound of her voice. He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and intense reverence, waiting for her word. Elara descended the grand marble steps of the dais, her movements fluid, graceful, and entirely filled with the majestic authority of a true sovereign. She did not look like the ragged maid they had sold into slavery. She looked like a goddess walking among mortals, her silver lotus necklace glowing brightly against her pale skin. She stopped a few feet away from her trembling family, looking down at them with a cold, profound pity that cut deeper than any blade. Richard lifted his tear-stained face, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Elara, please," he gasped, his voice cracking. "Forgive your old father. We did not know what you were. Save us from the beast." "Your father is not here, Richard," Elara spoke, her voice steady and powerful, echoing through the silent, breathless hall. "My father died in the dark cellar, where he locked me away to starve. My father died every time he raised his whip to carve scars into my flesh because he feared the light I carried. You are not my family. You are simply monsters who traded away a human soul to satisfy your greed." Clara and Melissa looked up, their voices trembling as they tried to reach out to touch the hem of her gown. "Sister, please," Clara sobbed. "You cannot let him slaughter us." Elara stepped back, avoiding their fingers. "Bloodline means nothing when it is poisoned by cruelty," she declared, her silver eyes flaring with a majestic light that made them flinch. "I will not let the king kill you today. Not because you deserve to live, but because I will not allow your wretched blood to stain the beautiful peace of this throne room. Your death would be too quick, too merciful for the decades of agony you inflicted upon the innocent. You wanted to treat me like property, so today I strip you of everything you own." She turned her gaze to the high counselors watching from the galleries, her voice taking on a sacred command. "By my authority as the Luna Queen of the North, I declare the house of Richard dissolved. Your lands, your castles, and your assets are hereby confiscated by the royal crown. You are stripped of your noble titles and your names. You will be cast out of the northern territories, banished to the lawless wastes beyond the outer borders, where no pack will ever grant you sanctuary. You will walk those barren lands as nameless, penniless beggars, enduring the same cold, hunger, and isolation that you forced upon me for 19 years. If you ever cross the border again, my warriors will end your miserable lives." Alpha Vance tried to muster a final shred of his alpha pride. "You cannot strip my pack of its alliance," he hissed. "The High Council will never allow a slave girl to change the laws of the realm." Elara turned her brilliant silver gaze upon him, and with a simple thought, she unleashed a tiny ripple of her divine aura. The scent of white lotus turned into a crushing spiritual weight that slammed into Vance's chest. The rogue Alpha let out a choked gasp, his knees buckling as he was slammed violently onto the stone floorboards, unable to breathe under the absolute majesty of her power. "The High Council belongs to the past, Vance," Elara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The future belongs to those who have a voice. Your alliance is severed, your pack is fined 3/4 of its wealth, and you will bow to the crown or share their exile." Vance pressed his face against the floor, whimpering in submission. Elara turned around, walking back up the steps to stand beside Kaelen. The king looked at her, his silver eyes swimming with an intense pride and an adoration so deep it made his chest ache. He realized that she had not just spared their lives out of weakness. She had executed a justice far more profound than death. She had completely erased their existence, proving her absolute sovereignty and mercy. establishing her rule not through mindless slaughter, but through unbreakable royal authority. The court stood in a breathless silence, realizing that the era of the cruel warlord had ended, and the majestic reign of the true Luna Queen had officially begun. The morning sun climbed high over the grand peaks of the northern mountains, bathing the shadow fortress in a brilliant golden warmth that had been missing for generations. In the grand assembly hall, where the oldest laws of the realm had been carved into heavy tablets of black stone, a historic gathering was taking place. The room was packed with Alpha Lords, pack elders, shamans, and representatives from every corner of the vast empire. They did not sit with their usual arrogant posture. Instead, they watched the grand dais with a quiet, breathless reverence. At the center of the stage stood a massive oak table covered in ancient leather-bound scrolls that detailed the brutal traditional laws of the northern packs. Behind the table stood Luna Queen Elara, her silver gown shimmering like the surface of a mountain lake under the sun. Beside her, King Kaelen stood like an immovable mountain of pure muscle and absolute devotion, his large hand resting gently on the hilt of his sword, his silver eyes scanning the crowd with a fierce protective pride. Elara looked out at the sea of faces, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of an ancient decree that allowed families to sell their Omega children to pay off debts. Her mind drifted back to the terrifying night she had been dragged through the mud at the border. Crossing, remembered as a broken thing meant only to be traded away. She remembered the centuries of silent suffering endured by countless Omegas who had been stripped of their voices, their rights, and their dignity under these very laws. A deep, unyielding determination solidified within her chest. She looked up, her silver eyes flashing with a brilliant, majestic authority that instantly silenced the murmurs in the back of the hall. Her white lotus scent expanded through the cavernous space, not as a submissive fragrance, but as a powerful sacred force that commanded absolute respect. For too long this kingdom has measured its strength by how heavily it can crush the powerless. Elara began, her voice clear, melodic, and ringing with a sovereign power that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. We have allowed the sacred gifts of the moon goddess to be treated as commodities, and we have allowed the weak to be silenced in the name of tradition. But a kingdom that builds its foundation on the tears of the innocent is a kingdom built on sand. Today the old ways end. Today we rewrite the destiny of the North. She picked up a heavy silver quill, her hand perfectly steady. With a single deliberate stroke, she crossed out the ancient decree of debt trading. From this moment on, by my authority as your Luna Queen, and backed by the unyielding power of the Alpha King, I declare the complete and absolute abolition of Omega slavery, servitude, and debt trading across every territory of this empire. No family shall ever have the right to sell their child. No Alpha shall ever have the right to possess another living soul as property. Any pack that attempts to trade, abuse, or silence an Omega will be stripped of their lands, their titles, and banished from our borders. A sudden murmur of shock and resistance rippled through the older council members. An elderly Alpha Lord stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation. Your Majesty, he gasped, these laws have held our alliance together for 300 years. If we abolish the debt trades, the economy of the outer territories will collapse and the Alphas will rebel against the crown. You are dismantling the very structure of our society. Before the old man could finish his sentence, King Kaelen took a step forward, his massive presence radiating a terrifying, suffocating dominance that made the floorboards groan beneath his boots. The shadows around him flared with a lethal intensity, and his deep voice cut through the hall like a wave of thunder. My queen has spoken, Kaelen growled, his silver eyes flashing with a dangerous light that made the elderly Alpha instantly drop to his knees in terror. The structure of our society was broken the moment it allowed monsters to abuse the innocent. If any alpha in my lands wishes to rebel against her new laws, let them step forward now. Let them face my wolf on the battlefield. I will personally ensure that their blood cleanses the land they wish to corrupt. My sword, my army, and my wolf belong entirely to the Queen, and her laws will be enforced with absolute unyielding force. The finality in the king's voice silenced the entire assembly. The council members realized that Kaelen was no longer just a terrifying warlord driven mad by a curse. He was a husband completely devoted to his mate, a king who proudly stood a step behind his queen to let her voice shake the world. Elara looked at Kaelen, her heart swelling with an intense, overwhelming love that vibrated through the fated bond between them. She reached out her small hand, wrapping around his large fingers, sending a beautiful pulse of tranquil white light through the hall, balancing his terrifying anger with her sacred peace. She turned back to the assembly, her voice soft, but carrying an unbreakable authority. "We are not destroying our kingdom," she said, her silver eyes sweeping across the crowd. "We are finally making it strong. We will establish sanctuaries and training academies in every major city. Omegas will no longer be hidden in the dark corners of pack houses. They will be educated, they will be protected, and they will hold seats on the High Council. We will build a future where strength is measured by the ability to protect, not the power to oppress." The high shamans stepped forward, bowing their heads low as they lifted the newly rewritten scrolls, sealing them with the royal golden wax. The crowd of nobles, seeing the absolute unity between the fierce king and the magnificent queen, finally fell to their knees. A deafening roar of approval erupted from the younger warriors and the servants standing at the back of the hall, their cheers echoing through the fortress walls. Elara stood tall, a profound sense of empowerment washing over her soul. She had changed the laws of an empire, she had given a voice to the voiceless, and she had permanently altered the course of history, a mini cliffhanger hanging in the air as a messenger suddenly rushed into the hall with a sealed letter from the distant eastern kingdoms. 10 years passed like a beautiful golden dream, shifting across the northern mountains. The heavy black stone of the Shadow Fortress no longer loomed as a terrifying monument of fear and dark curses. Instead, it had been completely reborn into a radiant, sprawling palace of sanctuary and light. In the heart of the estate, where the dead royal gardens had once rotted, a massive white stone academy now stood proud. It was the Luna Sanctuary, a place of learning and protection founded by Queen Elara herself. Here young Omegas from every pack across the continent gathered, not to hide their secondary genders or suppress their auras, but to learn how to harness their unique spiritual gifts and find their true voices. They walked through the sunlit courtyards with their heads held high, knowing that their lives were sacred and fully protected by the laws of the land. Elara stood on the high ivory balcony overlooking the beautiful, bustling academy below. She wore a simple yet elegant gown of soft blue silk that caught the warm afternoon sunlight, her long dark hair falling gracefully over her shoulders. Around her delicate neck, the silver lotus necklace rested proudly, its moonstone gleaming with a tranquil, steady power that had never faded. The intricate mate mark on her skin pulsed with a deep, comforting warmth, a constant reminder of the day her soul had been permanently bound to the Alpha King. As she watched, a group of children playing below, her heart swelled with an overwhelming, breathtaking sense of accomplishment. She had lived a childhood of absolute isolation, starving in a dark cellar and enduring the heavy blows of cruelty. But now, looking at the bright future she had built, she knew that every tear she had ever shed had been transformed into a seed of ultimate empowerment for an entire generation. She had taken her pain and used it to change the world, proving that the most powerless could become the architects of peace. A pair of large, powerful arms wrapped gently around her waist from behind, pulling her securely against a broad, muscular chest. Elara did not flinch. She simply leaned back into the embrace, letting a soft, blissful smile grace her lips as the deep familiar fragrance of cedarwood and burning embers enveloped her soul. King Kaelen pressed a tender reverent kiss against the crown of her head, his long silver hair brushing against her cheek. The once feared butcher of the north, the feral warlord, who had been driven mad by an ancient blood curse, was completely at peace. His striking silver eyes watched the academy below with a calm, majestic pride. For 10 years his wolf had known nothing but absolute tranquility, a miracle provided entirely by the pure healing aura of his fated mate. He had enforced her new laws with an iron fist, dismantling the old corrupt pack houses and ensuring that her voice remained the absolute supreme authority of the empire. He had spent every single day of his life worshipping the queen, who had saved him from his own darkness, earning her trust over and over again. "Look at what you have created, my beautiful Queen Kaelen," whispered his deep, rough voice, a soothing rumble that sent a wave of electric sweetness through her veins.
Help!
"You took a kingdom of shadows and turned it into an empire of light." Elara turned slightly within his embrace, lifting her small hand to gently cup his sharp handsome jawline, her silver eyes locking onto his with an unyielding depth of devotion. "We created this together, Kaelen," she murmured, her voice carrying a poetic, emotional warmth that made his inner wolf purr with absolute contentment. "You gave me the space to speak, you gave me your protection when I was hidden in the dark, and you showed me that I was worth fighting for. Our love was the true miracle that shattered the curse." Their beautiful moment of peace was interrupted by the sound of hurried, joyful footsteps running across the marble floorboards of the balcony. A beautiful 5-year-old boy with his father's striking silver hair and his mother's brilliant silver eyes came bursting through the glass doors, a tiny wooden sword gripped tightly in his hand. "Mother, father, look what the general taught me today," the young prince cried out, his face glowing with a pure, innocent happiness. He was the royal heir, a child born from the purest fated mate bond, destined to inherit a world of equality and peace. Kaelen let out a low, joyful laugh, dropping to one knee to catch the young boy in his massive arms, lifting him high into the air as Elara watched with tears of absolute gratitude shining in her eyes. The dark history of their bloodlines had been completely erased, replaced by a beautiful legacy of love, chosen family, and unbreakable unity. The future of the North was brighter than the sun, and they would rule it together side by side for the rest of their days. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.